Hello, this is Alex Bliss, and today we are going to be talking about organizing information of species in PowerPoint form because I lack the high quality camera and I don't have any way to support my phone in a reasonable way. So this will have to do for now. Now, the first thing we're going to get into is the whole big picture here, which is classifying life. Generally, life is classified into taxonomic ranks. I'm sure you're familiar with that sort of thing. But we're going to get more into detail of why and sort of how it happens. Of course, naturally, classifying every living species on the planet is generally useful for distinguishing things and keeping everything organized and knowing maybe what's related to this, how is this similar to that, did this descend from this, are these things in the same group? It's just kind of important to keep everything in a nice organized fashion as it streamlines other processes and stuff. But the key thing we're going to talk about right here is phylogeny. Pretty much what this is it's an evolutionary history of the species. You know, where do they descend from, that sort of thing. Uh, Species have traces of unique evolutionary histories, so they'll have certain traits that get constantly passed down. Like as you see here in the image below, different traits will get passed down further and further and further, and they'll split off when one of these traits isn't carried on or a new one is derived. And one of the ways we look for these things are characters, and not necessarily a character like a letter or a symbol or like a character in like a movie. It means something different here. It's pretty much any quantifiable or heritable trait. Like, say, how many segments are in the backbone of this animal, or does this animal have wings, and how are they used? It's that sort of thing. They kind of go together. And these groups of different species are based off of these characteristics. But it doesn't always mean that they're directly related. Certain species might have similar traits, but not come from the same exact species. What evolutionary biologists try to do is pinpoint a common ancestor, the one ancestor that these multiple species must have descended from, in order to like pinpoint their similarities and such. And they do this by looking for a derived trait. A derived trait is a character present in a group but not in any of the species' ancestors. So it'll be present in, say, this one animal, but if you go all the way back to its ancestor, it won't have that trait. So that's what that means. It's derived. That's kind of where the name comes from. But anyway, that's kind of how that works. And it's important to note, because I'm going to be using the term later, that every species is its own clade. And a clade is a group whose members share one or more of these derived traits. The word clade is going to come up several times later, so it's important to have that established. Next up, we have morphological divergence. This goes hand in hand with morphological convergence, which we're going to talk about next, but I'm just doing this one first. Pretty much all it is body parts that appear similar in separate species because they come from a common ancestor. And that's homologous structures. Kind of messed up a bit there, but that's what that is. And a homologous structure, as you see there on the picture, you've got this foot, and of course it evolves into a bunch of different limbs that are present in a bunch of different animals. So it can be the wing of a chicken, or a flipper in a penguin, or a porpoise. It'll evolve into different things, even though they all come from the same base. So morphological divergence is essentially an evolutionary pattern where these different things change from a same base ancestor or common ancestor. So it's like diverse lineages can repurpose these limbs for different purposes. So even though it's the base limb of a foot, it can be repurposed into flying or stronger running or swimming, that sort of thing. So this will bring us next into morphological convergence. And if you can kind of sense the opposites here, it's kind of the other way around. So pretty much, body parts that appear similar aren't always homologous structures. So even though insects and bats and birds, they all have wings, but they're not necessarily homologous structures. And why is this? I mean, they're all wings, right? Shouldn't they be? But that's not the case. This is because they're actually analogous structures. And essentially what that means is that these are independent evolutions of similar body parts. So they all evolved these wings separately. They didn't all descend from one common ancestor. So pretty much, how does that happen? How do they get all these, well, how do they all get wings if they didn't descend from the same thing? This is usually due to stuff like environmental pressures or other such evolutionary methods where they just evolve these things naturally like most other species would, just not from the same common ancestor. Like for the example here, you got your bats, your birds, and your insects, which are, well, insects, mammals, and birds. And they all have these wing structures, but they all are adapted differently, making them not homologous structures. For example, the bird wings are covered in feathers, and the bat wings have the thin skin flaps, and insect wings are like an extension of the exoskeleton, so it's not even like a similar thing. They're not even limbs, technically. Well, not in the same way that arms or legs can turn into wings, in the sense of the bat. As you can see in the image, it's the fingers stretched out over the wing membrane. But not talking about divergence or convergence, we get into our next bit here, which is biochemistry. Pretty much what this is, or what we're going to be talking about here, is the molecular clock. Now, what happens is over time, mutations will occur to modify a genome's DNA sequence. This just kind of happens over a long period of time. Small little mutations. Of course, naturally, some mutations will have effects on a species' survival, but sometimes a mutation has no effect at all. It doesn't really do anything, or negatively impact or positively impact. It just happens. And these mutations are considered neutral mutations. And this is what the molecular clock here references: neutral mutations in DNA. So if we're going to talk about this in like a metaphorical sense, you would take this clock, it's not a real clock, but you rewind the clock tick by tick, which each tick is one of these neutral mutations, until you go all the way to the beginning of the lineage's unique evolutionary path, to find this common ancestor, sort of, and that each progressive neutral mutation tick progresses along the species down a different path, as opposed to maybe some other species that's going down a different one. So the less time between these unique neutral mutations between the two lineages, the more recently they've diverged from one another. And that's also why related species have more similar genomes. So that explains that. And then finally, we're going to get here into development. So the more closely related an animal is, the more similar its development is going to be. So for a pretty important example, all vertebrates have a stage in their embryos where they have 4 buds for limbs and a tail. So as you can see, there's different embryos for different species here, and all of them have these little buds present for their limbs and also a tail, even humans, even though we don't have tails. So now we're going to get into that bit. So if all of the embryos for all of these species are, well, not exactly one for one the same, but are similar, how come when they're fully grown, they don't all look the same or all look very similar? I mean, certain animals will look similar, but, a human doesn't look very similar to, say, a bird. The resemblance just isn't there. Well, this is because of master genes. Master genes whose expression causes these formations, like the limbs and such in developing embryos, the way they are expressed and the patterns that they are expressed are all different in each organism. And because of this, it creates variations which eventually lead to the final product of the animal being birthed and then, growing to its full potential. All these little variations and patterns cause these differences, which will lead to, well, the species ultimately being that species and not just, oh, it's similar and they all look the same. So that's why that happens. So overall, this is pretty much how species are classified. It's basically based off of common ancestors and homologous structures and that sort of thing. And we use things like the biochemistry, or this development segment right here, is more to like reference and analyze how similar species are, or are they similar to begin with, or, is their similarity just a result of like different evolutionary pressures and stuff like that. very broad in terms, but that's essentially how it works. It's very important to sort of keep all this classification going because it's just kind of, well, it's a very underlooked thing. You might not think this kind of organization or super scientific classification is really necessary, but at the end of the day, it kind of is. Organization is one of those things that just sort of makes everything easier and makes other processes easier. And without it, everything involving classification or species would be a lot more difficult or time consuming. And this just helps streamline and create a good base for a lot of studies. So with that being said, this is my little video here. And, well, thank you for listening.